When I picked up the phone that cold November morning, I thought it would be another call from the pharmacy reminding me about my father's medication, or perhaps one of those endless bills slipping further and further into red. But the voice on the other end, calm, deliberate, almost too precise, changed the air in my little kitchen. Claire Morgan, I believe we have an opportunity for you, though it's unlike anything you've done before. My hand tightened around the chipped mug of coffee. I didn't know this woman, yet she spoke my name as if she'd been rehearsing it. She told me she was calling on behalf of the Grant family. Yes, those Grants, the ones who owned half the coastline properties and most of the factories inland. They were seeking a private nurse, she said, someone who could commit to a delicate case. I remember the pause, just a heartbeat too long, before she added, "The patient is a 15-year-old girl who has not spoken or left her bedroom in over 2 years." I should have laughed or politely declined. Instead, I stared at the cracked tile floor as if it might answer for me. My mind kept circling the words, 2 years without leaving her room, and I felt a heaviness that had nothing to do with my father's worn armchair or the sagging walls of our small riverside home. "Why me?" I asked, and the woman's reply came without hesitation. "Because you don't ask for much, and you don't scare easily." If only she knew. After my husband died, 6 months of watching the cancer take him piece by piece, I'd been left with hospital debts so deep they seemed to echo when I opened the mail. I worked nights at the small clinic, mornings at the care home, and every spare hour tending to my father, whose lungs had been giving him trouble since the winter he turned 70. The idea of leaving him, even for a job that might clear the debts, felt like betrayal. But the woman's voice had a way of leaving no room for refusal. "It is a live-in position in the city, generous pay, all expenses covered. But there is one condition. You do not, under any circumstances, ask about the past." That last part lodged in my mind like a sliver. Not ask about the past? I'd been a nurse long enough to know that silence often hides more than illness. It hides the wound that no one dares to clean. When I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table, my coffee long gone cold, listening to the gulls outside and the slow tick of the clock. My father shuffled in, wrapped in his faded plaid robe. "Another night shift?" he asked, rubbing his chest. I shook my head. Maybe something else. Maybe something different. The rest of that day moved in a blur, writing down the medication schedule for my neighbor, folding clothes into a suitcase that felt far too small for the weight in my chest. I told myself it was temporary. A few months, enough to catch up on bills, enough to breathe without the taste of panic. By nightfall, the bus timetable sat folded in my coat pocket, and the sea air outside carried that sharp, briny promise of winter storms. I stepped out to bring in the mail, expecting only the usual stack of envelopes. But there, among the bills and grocery flyers, lay a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with deep red wax. The imprint was unmistakable, a stylized G surrounded by a ring of laurel leaves. The Grant family crest. The strangest part? I hadn't given them my address. The city greeted me with a sky the color of wet slate and a wind that sliced through my coat before I'd even stepped off the bus. For years, I had come here only for hospital visits or to chase down medical supplies that our small-town pharmacy couldn't stock. But that morning felt different. It wasn't just the cold. It was the certainty that I was stepping into a life that had nothing to do with mine, a life I could leave no mark on, and one that might swallow me whole if I wasn't careful. A driver in a dark overcoat met me at the curb, holding a discreet placard with my name, Claire Morgan, printed in neat serif letters. He didn't offer more than a polite nod, and I found myself grateful for the silence as I climbed into the back seat. The city's noise faded almost instantly once the car doors closed. Only the faint hiss of the heater filled the space, the glass fogging at the corners. We drove through streets I'd only ever seen in glossy magazines. Rows of townhouses with ornate facades, high-end shops with mannequins frozen mid-stride, their dresses worth more than a year of my rent. The driver turned into a long, tree-lined avenue, each trunk wrapped in strands of pale white lights. At the end of it, the Grant estate rose like a memory someone had tried to erase but failed. The outlines were still there, sharp against the gray sky. The iron gates parted soundlessly, and we rolled up a gravel drive so pristine, it looked as though each stone had been washed and placed by hand. The mansion loomed ahead, 4 stories of pale stone and black shutters, every window draped with curtains drawn just so. It was beautiful in the way a photograph might be, perfect, untouchable, and utterly lifeless. When the car stopped, the driver moved quickly to take my bag. I stepped out, my boots crunching against the gravel, and the cold air rushed in, smelling faintly of cedar and something else. Polish, perhaps, the kind that lingers in museums. The front doors opened before I reached them, revealing a tall, spare woman with silver hair swept neatly back from her face. She wore a slate gray suit, tailored to precision, and a string of pearls that caught the light without flaunting it. Evelyn Grant. "Miss Morgan," she said, her voice smooth but not warm. "Welcome. I trust your journey was comfortable." I murmured something about the efficiency of the arrangements, but my attention was already drifting past her shoulder into the grand foyer beyond. It was vast. Marble floors so polished they reflected the chandelier above in crisp detail, walls lined with oil portraits in heavy gilt frames, a staircase that curved upward like it had nowhere urgent to be. The air was still, scented faintly with roses that, I suspected, were cut fresh every morning, whether anyone noticed or not. Evelyn stepped aside, gesturing for me to enter. My footsteps echoed more loudly than I intended, each one a small trespass. There were no scuffs on the floor, no uneven carpet runners, no sign that anyone had ever rushed here or laughed loudly enough to disturb the air. "This will be your home for as long as you are with us," Evelyn said, leading me past a series of closed doors. "The household is discreet. We value quiet and order here. Meals are served promptly at the appointed times, and we keep to certain routines for everyone's comfort." Her tone made it clear that everyone did not include me. We paused at the base of the staircase, and that's when I saw it, a flicker of movement in an upstairs window just beyond the landing. A curtain shifted, revealing the pale outline of a face. The hair was long, dark, and slightly tangled, the skin so light it almost blended into the glass. Even from here I could feel the weight of her gaze. Lila Grant. In the moment it took me to blink, she was gone, the curtain falling back into perfect stillness. Evelyn noticed where I was looking. "Lila is shy," she said, the pause heavy enough to hold a dozen unspoken truths. "You'll have time to meet her properly." We moved on, deeper into the house. Every room we passed looked like it belonged in a magazine spread. Precisely arranged furniture, vases of flowers in perfect symmetry, books shelved by height and color. But there was something suffocating about it, like a stage set waiting for actors who never came. "You'll find your quarters at the end of the east wing," Evelyn said as we reached a smaller corridor. "You'll have privacy, but I do expect you to be available at any hour should Lila require attention." She opened a door to reveal a modest but well-appointed suite, bed neatly turned down, a writing desk under the window, and a small adjoining bathroom. The window overlooked the gardens, bare for winter, their hedges clipped into severe shapes. I set my bag down, feeling both anchored and trapped. "I'll give you the evening to settle in," Evelyn said, glancing at the delicate watch on her wrist. "We'll meet for breakfast at 8 sharp. Lila may join us, though I can't promise it." She left without waiting for a reply, her heels clicking a rhythm that faded into silence. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the muted hum of the house, the faint tick of a distant clock, the low creak of old wood. Then a soft shuffle broke the stillness. Turning, I saw a man in a dark uniform standing in the doorway. He was middle-aged with kind eyes set deep in a lined face. He held a folded linen napkin as if he'd just come from the dining room. "Miss Morgan," he said quietly, his voice carrying a note of something I couldn't place. "A word of advice. Be careful what you find here." Before I could ask what he meant, he inclined his head and disappeared down the hall, leaving me alone with the echo of his warning. The first morning I stood outside the door at the end of the gallery. Cream paint, brass handle polished to a pale moon. My knuckles hovered, then fell. "Good morning, Lila Grant. It's Claire Morgan," I said, keeping my voice low, like I might startle a bird perched on a windowsill. Silence answered, thick, undisturbed. I tried again, the way I had spoken to other frightened patients, with small, practical offers. Tea, a book, a window cracked for fresh air. "I can leave them by the door," I added, as if the door itself were a living thing that could be fed warm steam and paper stories. The quiet beyond didn't flinch. Somewhere down the corridor, a clock began to chime the half hour, each note skating along marble before it died. I set a tray on a narrow table by the jamb. Porcelain cup, a silver spoon, a slice of brioche spread with apricot jam I'd found cooling on a rack in the kitchen. "If you prefer something else," I said, "I'll bring it." My words hung, and I felt suddenly foolish, a stranger speaking to a sealed room, as if I'd come to negotiate with winter itself. The brass handle trembled. No, I imagined it, just the heat of my breath making ghosts on the lacquer. I waited long enough to feel the tea losing its ribbon of steam, then began to walk away. 3 steps, 4, when a sound touched my shoulder. The softest rustle, cloth against wood, the suggestion of a body-shifting weight. I turned back too quickly. The hallway wavered in the morning light. The handle remained a small golden crescent. The door did not open. By noon I had tried 2 more times, once with a small stack of books from the library downstairs, bird guides, a slim novel with a watercolor cover, a volume of poems whose spine creaked like an old knee. Once with a jar of wildflower honey and a pale napkin embroidered with the letter G. I said Lila Grant and Claire Morgan, the way one might say a blessing. Nothing. Even the air seemed to learn our names and keep them for itself, as if it wanted proof that we had in fact met, if only through wood and paint. It is a particular kind of ache, that first day when a patient refuses the hand you extend. Gentle, steady, not demanding, merely there. It reminded me, unexpectedly, savagely, of a winter when I was 16 and the house smelled of eucalyptus and boiled potatoes. When my mother lay in a bed near the window, the curtains making a trembling, greenish light. After she died, people spoke softly to me, their mouths full of careful phrases, as though grief would crack if they were too loud. But the world went bright and sharp for me, frost on the windows like spider silk, the ticking clock relentless, as if someone had replaced my eyes with glass. I stopped leaving my room. I learned the language of doorways, what they say when they close, what they say when they do not open. I learned that, if I held my breath, I could hear the kettle click off 2 rooms away. I learned to be a creature of thresholds, pressed flat as a moth behind the shade. When my aunt would knock, "Claire Morgan, darling, are you hungry?" I wanted to answer. The answer swelled like a tide and then receded, leaving me empty and breathless on the sand of my own chest. I never answered, not for days, not until the hunger in my stomach spoke louder than the hunger in my throat. Remembering that, remembering my own small island of silence, I left a sheet of paper on the tray with the tea and the honey and wrote only, "When you are ready." The letters looked too formal. I added a quick, wavering sketch of a willow tree, the kind that wept into our river back home, its branches trailing like hair. I set the pencil on the edge, daring to imagine she might lift it, make her own mark. I walked the house in slow circuits that afternoon, mapping the places where the quiet pooled deepest. The grand drawing room kept its hush in velvet folds. A long, mirror-lipped hallway repeated me endlessly, as if the house would rather have reflections than guests. I passed a set of double doors that the staff had polished to a dull shine. There was no placard, only a keyhole that looked like a small, surprised mouth. I paused. The air near those doors smelled faintly, improbably, of lemon oil and something older, resinous and sweet, like rosin on a bow. A music room, I thought, though no sound leaked from it, not even the cooling thump of a piano string. My fingertips hovered over the seam where the doors met. Cool, still. I moved on. In the kitchen, an expanse of white tile and copper pots that burned with soft light, the housekeeper, Margaret, was dusting powdered sugar on a ring of pastries. "Miss Claire Morgan," she said without looking up, "we keep a tray by the girls' door at 2, at 5, and again at 7. If it comes back untouched, we change it for something else. We do not push." Her hands, deft, motherly, were a calm all their own. "And if the tray disappears?" "Then you wait," she said, finally meeting my eyes. "You wait, and you act as though you did not notice." She has to choose the world. I carried the 5 o'clock tray myself. Delicate sandwiches with cucumber sliced thinner than truth, a tiny bowl of berries so dark they were almost black, a cup of cocoa that steamed like breath on a cold morning. I knocked, said her name, and the name felt different now, less like a password, more like a candle. I left the tray and retreated just beyond the turn in the hall, where a shadow from a window fell like a slash of shade across the carpet. I leaned against the wall and listened. Minutes unfurled, slow ribbon. The cocoa made a sweet fog. A whisper of metal, subtle, the tender complaint of a hinge. I held still, the way a deer holds when the field changes wind. Something, someone, took the tray, careful enough that the porcelain did not clink. I saw in the corner of my eye the briefest slip of a sleeve, gray, soft, a thread frayed at the cuff. The door closed again, not a click, just a returned quiet. The shadow beside me felt warmer. "Thank you," I said into the empty air. I did not expect an answer, and none came. At dusk, the house put on its evening face. Lamps dimmed to honey, corridors deepened to wine. The sky beyond the east windows softened until the trees were only strokes of ink. I checked on my father's text messages. Short, brave, full of weather reports and complaints about his television remote, and told him I was fine, that the city smelled like rain and bleach, that my bed was too large for my bones. I told him not to worry, the last lie of every day. When I stepped into the corridor again, the hush felt different, more intent, like a hand over a mouth. The staff retreated into soft tasks, the kind you can do without looking, folding linen, counting crystal, setting tomorrow's silver to sleep. I found myself back near the unmarked double doors. The lemon oil scent was stronger at night, threading the cold with a promise I could not name. I tried the handle. Of course it did not yield. Locked, definitively, disdainfully. The keyhole shone. "You won't get in there," came a voice behind me, gentle, not unkind. I turned to find the same man who had warned me the day before, the folded linen replaced now by a polished brass key ring that flashed against his black waistcoat. Not without permission. "What is it?" I asked. "It smells like—" I hesitated, embarrassed by the intimacy of scent. "Like an old recital hall." The man's mouth softened. "The music room," he said. "It has been closed for some time." "Does anyone play?" I asked, as if the question were not absurd, as if sound could bloom from a room with its lungs stopped. "No one," he said. "And everyone." His eyes flicked to the ceiling. Habit, perhaps, or caution. "Good night, Miss Claire Morgan." When he had gone, I stood a moment longer, my skin prickling with the idea of silence that remembered song. I set my palm flat against the panel. For an instant I felt nothing. Then absurdly, I felt the exact opposite of nothing. The way a seashell remembers the ocean. The way a closed book remembers its reader's breath. I removed my hand as though I had touched something living. At 7, I carried the last tray to the door at the end of the gallery. "Good evening, Lila Grant," I said, and I heard my voice answer me from the polished floor. "Good evening, Claire Morgan," as if the house wanted a conversation and settled for echo. I brought chamomile and honey and a slice of the lemon cake that made the whole kitchen smell like afternoon. I waited, but I did not hover. I set the tray down and walked away, slower this time. I wanted her to know that I was not a hawk circling, more like a lighthouse, visible, steady, too far off to frighten. Sleep, when it came, was a shallow pond. I lay in the small bed in my east wing room, the window cracked an inch to let in the stinging city air. I dreamed of rivers braided with light, of doorways that opened into other doorways, of a girl in a window whose face blurred until it became a moon. I woke once to the soft thunder of a passing truck and thought, with a foolish rush of hope, that it was the sea. Near midnight, thirsty, I slipped on a sweater and stepped into the corridor. The house at that hour was a cathedral, vast, emptied, full of careful darkness. My feet made no sound on the carpet, a river of pale blue that flowed, unbroken, past portraits whose eyes were tired of watching. I walked toward the staircase, intending to find the kitchen for water, when something caught me, a shadow where there should have been none. It gathered near the unmarked doors, tall and narrow, more suggestion than shape. I froze, the way you do when the body decides the eyes are no longer in charge. The shadow tilted, just so, like a head listening. A pulse hammered in my ears. I took one step forward, two. The shadow thinned, as if exhaling, and slipped along the seam of the doors, then erased itself into the dark. I was left with my ridiculous heartbeat and the lemon oil scent, which suddenly seemed mournful. I pressed my ear to the panel, my cheek chilled by the polish. Nothing. Only the distant house noises that are not noises at all, the settling of old wood, the breath of vents. I started to straighten. "Silly Claire Morgan, go back to bed. The night makes toys of your senses," when the sound arrived. So faint I thought it had been smuggled into my skull. A single note, piano soft, as if a fingertip had brushed a key and then thought better of it. Another, half a heartbeat later, barely there. Not a melody, not even a phrase, just the shy, ghostly testing of sound against silence, the way a child tests water with her toes. I stepped back from the door, both hands lifted without knowing why, like I'd stumbled into a chapel. The corridor held its breath. The note came again, a different key, nearby on the keyboard, but not its neighbor, like a question answered by a cousin. 4 notes, then 5, spaced out, fragile as moths, and then nothing. The quiet returned, heavier than before, as though the house had swallowed what it could not bear to let escape. The doors were still locked under my palm. I tried the handle. Gently, silly ritual. Close tight. Lila Grant, I whispered into the seam, hardly daring to let the words exist. It's Claire Morgan. My breath fogged the lacquer. From the other side, no footsteps, no stool scraped across a floor, no laugh, a silence so complete it felt like snow. I waited there a long minute, listening for one more secret note. When it did not come, I backed away. One step, two, keeping my eyes on the keyhole the way you keep your eyes on the horizon when the boat tips. In my room, the air smelled faintly of wool and old books. I shut the window and climbed into bed, the sheet cool against my legs. The darkness behind my eyelids was threaded with ivory and black, with fingers hovering, with a room that remembered music too well to forget it cleanly. Before sleep took me, swiftly, fiercely, like a tide, I thought not for the first time since I arrived. The house is a museum, yes, but a museum with a heartbeat. And somewhere, behind a locked door, behind a girl's window, behind a silence that had learned to speak for her, something had started to press back. Morning arrived like a held breath. Thin light pressed against the curtains, a hush riding the hallways as if the house had decided to tiptoe around its own memories. I stood again at the door at the end of the gallery with a new tray. Not the formal china this time, but a mug with a chipped rim from the back of the cupboard, the kind you find in ordinary kitchens where someone laughs while the kettle sings. "Good morning, Lila Grant. It's Claire Morgan," I said, soft, steady. "I've brought chamomile with a slice of pear and a spoon of honey. If you don't want the honey, I can come back with cinnamon, or nothing at all. Your choice." I placed beside the mug a small square of watercolor paper and a pencil with a dull tip. No note, no instruction, just the invitation of blankness, the kind of silence that can be filled. Waiting never gets easier. Your body learns a patience your blood refuses. But I stood there long enough to feel the mug's warmth seep into the wood. Then I moved away, just around the bend where the afternoon light usually lands, and listened to the door breathe. The whisper came, fabric touching wood, the delicate metal sigh of a latch. Then that careful, careful movement I was beginning to recognize. The tray slid over the threshold, light shifted, then the door was a door again, innocent and dumb. I let the minutes spread thin. When I returned, the mug was lighter, the pear gone. The square of paper was missing. The pencil remained, rolled a fraction, as though it had just been set down and thought better of staying still. "Thank you," I said, to the door, to the air, to the part of me that had needed this small ceremony as much as I hoped she did. I made a game with myself that day, one I did not write down, one I did not speak aloud. At 2 o'clock, I left a book of birds. Nothing fine, just a field guide with pages that smelled faintly of old rain. I tucked a red ribbon into the chapter on winter visitors and folded a triangle in the page that showed the river swallow with its ink blue back. At 5, I left another square of paper and a charcoal stub, my palm smeared gray by the time I set it down. At 7, a tiny glass bottle with 3 pink petals, roses stolen from the edge of the formal arrangement in the dining room, petals that looked like they had forgotten how to be stern. When the 7 o'clock tray returned, the bottle was empty. One petal clung to the rim as though kissing it goodbye. The paper was gone again. The charcoal stub had left a smudge on the linen as if a fingertip had tested its weight. Progress, I told myself, exaggerating the word with a smile so it would not dissolve. Progress does not knock. Progress leaves fingerprints. After the trays, the house gave itself over to its evening rituals, silver laid out like a quiet constellation, lamps dimmed to amber, footsteps reduced to gentle commas in the long, polished sentences of the hall. I drifted toward the library, a room that smelled of leather and citrus and dust that had made peace with itself. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their spines a chorus of browns and blues. I ran a finger along the titles, not reading, just listening. I found a thin book of poetry about rivers and tucked it beneath my arm, not because I thought it would help, but because rivers have always been more patient than grief, and sometimes the object matters less than the water it remembers. On my way back, I passed the door again. I did not knock. I did not say my name. I simply rested my hand flat on the wood for a second, then walked on, leaving the impression of warmth, leaving the idea that a palm could be a promise. When I turned, I saw it, so small I would have missed it if the hall light hadn't decided to bless me. The seam at the edge of the door was open the width of a thumbnail. An invitation or an accident, I could not know. My breath chose caution. "Good night, Lila Grant," I said and kept walking. The next morning, the same tray, the same gentle exchange, I took the boldest step I had allowed myself. "I have fresh linens if it's all right," I said, glancing toward the far end of the corridor where no one watched. "I can come back later, or now. Only if you prefer." Silence, then a breath. Mine or the room's, I couldn't say, and the faintest movement of shadow along the crack. The door opened enough to admit a person who understood the liturgy of narrow spaces. I slipped through, careful not to let the latch bite. Rooms can be loud with quiet. You know it as soon as your eyes adjust. The first thing I noticed was the window, the same one I had seen from below, its glass milky with the sheen of morning. A chair stood beside it, blanket folded too neatly over the back, like a smile held too long. Books were stacked in a careful column near the wall, spines turned inward. A wardrobe with mirrored doors faced the bed, old wood, new knobs, as if the past had been given permission to gleam. The bed itself was made, covers drawn smooth, but the inset where a small body might have curled remained, a shallow bowl in the center, the ghost of sleep. "I'll be quick," I whispered, though whispering was unnecessary. "Claire Morgan will be quick." I stripped the bed with the reverence of setting down a prayer, the crisp sheet, the soft one beneath. I could feel her in the room the way you feel someone standing behind a curtain, the slight pressure of awareness, the small electricity of attention. I kept my eyes on my hands, fresh linen, folded open like morning, pillow smoothed, blanket shaken, gentle so as not to startle the air. Something on the desk caught my eye, a square of paper with the corner pinned beneath a glass. I did not reach for it, I did not lean. I let the image arrive as it pleased, the suggestion of wings, a beak, a line like a willow whip, a bird drawn in sure strokes, not perfect, not tentative either, alive enough to feel the air it would choose. My throat tightened. I did not speak. A second square lay beneath the first, blank, tucked as if the first drawing had been given a sibling and told to behave. I gathered the old sheets, pressing them to my chest so I would not be tempted to touch the drawing, and turned toward the door. That's when I felt it, the prickling sense of being regarded. It is not the same as being watched. Watched is a weight, regarded is a light laid upon you. In the mirror of the wardrobe, a slim slice of the room appeared, a triangle of window, a hint of the chair, and then, between two folds of curtain, a narrow area where shadow should have been solid but was, instead, threaded with pale. In that pale, a face, soft, not fully shown, the suggestion of an eye glancing sideways, not at me, but at my hands. I did not turn. Mirrors tell truer truths when you pretend you do not hear them speak. "Thank you for letting me change the linens," I said. Simple, like setting a cup on a table without comment. "Claire Morgan will leave the window opened a little, unless you want it closed. Tap the glass twice if you want it closed. once if you want it open. It felt like teaching a code to a boat in fog. I waited, one, two, and then heard it. A delicate tap, once, then after a heartbeat, another, once more. Open. Understood, I breathed, and the breath carried my smile to the glass. I left the room with the old sheets hugged to my ribs and the knowledge that a drawing existed where drawings had not existed yesterday. Margaret intercepted me in the hallway, her hands already reaching for the linen pile. Well, she asked, low enough for the floor to keep our secret. Did she? Paper, I said, unable, unwilling to smother the warmth in the word. A bird. I made the shape of wings with my fingers in the air, then dropped them like I had been caught dancing. Margaret's mouth softened into something that might have been relief. Keep your steps small, she murmured. Small and true. Big steps scare the ground. It was the kind of advice that sounds foolish until it saves your life. At noon, I brought the bird guide again and opened it to the page with swallows, setting it on the tray like a companion rather than a book. I added a tiny tin of colored pencils, most reduced to nubs, the red used down to a thumbnail, the blue hardly touched. If you want, I said, and stepped back into the bend of the light that had become my hiding place. The door performed its careful ritual. The tray disappeared. When it returned, the book came back with it, but not untouched. A single scrap of paper sat atop it, a torn corner from the pad, with a small, quick sketch that was somehow both playful and serious. The same bird, this time with a thread in its beak, a thread that ran off the edge of the scrap as if it had somewhere urgent to go. I felt a laugh rise, quiet, thick with gratitude. Beautiful, I said to the air between us. Claire Morgan thinks it's beautiful. I did not ask for more. Asking is a rope. Offerings are bridges. The afternoon folded itself neatly into the kind of gray that the city wears like a shawl. I checked the medication chart I had drawn up for the household. None for Lila Grant, not yet. But routines have a way of reassuring even those who are not bound by them. I spoke briefly with Evelyn Grant in the sunroom that refused to remember sun, sipped tea that tasted like polished manners, fielded a handful of questions that smelled less of concern than of control. Progress? She asked, arranging 3 cards of a solitaire that she never finished. Small thing, I said. The smallest are still things. She made a non-committal sound, a pearl clinking in a dish, and moved a queen from one stack to another, as if any movement were preferable to none. At 5, I brought another tray, a soft roll, butter, a slice of apple, a small square of cheese that would have made my father hum. I added a note, not words, only a line drawn in a single sweep, a suggestion of the river that ran behind my childhood home, the way it curved around a sandbar that disappeared when the rains came. When the tray returned, the paper lay beneath the cup. My river line had been extended, turned into a loop that became the handle of a cage drawn in light, swift strokes. Inside the cage, the bird, my bird, her bird, perched on a delicate bar. The door of the cage had been drawn ajar, not wide, not flung open in drama, just not latched. Above it, in the corner, a small triangle of sky, colored so faintly blue I might have imagined it. I sat on the floor right there in the corridor, knees drawn up like a girl, and balanced the drawing across them. The pencil marks had a surety that made my chest ache. Someone who knows the difference between a wing at rest and a wing about to lift. The ajar door was the smallest line of all, as if it knew that the brag belonged to the bird, not to its absence. I traced the open edge with the pad of my finger, not touching, only near, and whispered, yes. It would have been an easy thing to rush then, to flood the next tray with questions, to put color and paper and invitations and codes, to throw the door open and stand there like the world itself waiting with hands on hips. But I remembered the mirror and the eye that had not been frightened so much as measuring. I remembered the way my 16-year-old self had looked at a closed door and hated it and needed it in the same breath. So I did the slow, old-fashioned thing. I brought the 7 o'clock tea, just tea, and set it down with nothing but the drawing, propped against the tray like a little painting in a small gallery where the only visitor was silence. "Thank you, Lila Grant," I said. "Claire Morgan will keep the window open unless you ask for it closed. Tap twice if you change your mind." I waited for the metal sigh that meant the house was swallowing another offering. It came. The drawing vanished, carefully like a secret being put to bed. Night edged in, and the house put out its lights one by one, as if counting backwards from 100 until sleep agreed to try. I sat at my desk with the river poems open, but unread, and listened to the east wing decide what kind of darkness it would be. When the hour turned, something close to midnight, something that made the hall clocks soften their tick as if they too were drowsy, I heard it again. Not from the door at the end of the gallery this time, but from deeper inside the house, through stone, through wood, through the lemon-scented hush of the locked room. A note, clearer than last night, tender but less afraid. Another followed, then another, small steps over a stream, testing stones, learning which ones held. I stood very still in the center of my room, the way you stand when a bird lands on your wrist without asking permission. "Yes," I whispered to no one, and to the house itself. "Yes." And in my mind, because I did not dare give the thought too much voice, I saw the bird again. Not flying, not yet, but standing at the open door of its cage, head tilted toward a sound it recognized. Not the command of escape, not the shout of rescue, only music, a memory leaning forward, a future clearing its throat. The storm announced itself long before it arrived, first as a thickening in the air, the kind of humidity that clings to your neck like a hand you can't quite shake off. By late afternoon, the horizon had bruised to a deep violet, and the trees along the drive bent as if bowing to something none of us could see. I had been watching the sky from the small back window in my quarters, telling myself it would pass quickly, that the sea winds would push it inland, and we'd be spared the worst of it. But by the time I stepped into the main hallway, the first low roll of thunder had already shaken the glass in the tall windows. The house seemed to draw in a slow breath, preparing to endure. At 6:30 the rain came, not in drops but in sheets, hammering against the panes as though determined to break through. Lightning tore across the sky, momentary bones of light showing the skeleton of the world. And each time it did, the portraits in the hallway seemed to shudder. I had just set Lila's evening tea on the small table outside her door when the power went out. The darkness was instant and absolute, as if someone had thrown a heavy black cloth over the entire house. The silence that followed was worse than the storm itself, so sudden and heavy it made my ears ring. Then came the sound, small at first, a quick intake of breath from behind Lila's door. Another flash of lightning painted the hallway white, and I saw the outline of her shadow against the crack beneath the door. A whimper followed, thin as paper tearing. I knocked softly but urgently. "Lila Grant, it's Claire Morgan. I'm here." No answer, just a muffled, uneven breathing. I opened the door without waiting for permission. The room was darker than the hall, the curtains pulled tight, the air thick with the smell of rain pressing against the glass. Lightning flared, and in that brief, ghostly light I saw her, curled on the floor beside her bed, her arms wrapped so tightly around her knees it seemed she might fold into herself and vanish. Her eyes were wide and glassy, fixed on the shadows the storm threw against the walls. "It's just a storm," I said, kneeling beside her. "The lights will come back. I'm here with you, Lila Grant." She flinched when another crack of thunder rolled overhead, and that's when I heard it, the first sound I'd ever heard her make. A whisper so soft I thought I'd imagined it. "Mama." The word struck me harder than the thunder. It wasn't loud, it wasn't even clear, but it carried the ache of years compressed into two syllables. I wanted to freeze time, to hold that moment and not let it slip away into the dark. "I've got you," I said, slipping my arms around her carefully, as if she were made of spun glass. She resisted for a breath, then melted, trembling into my hold. Her body was cold, the way a frightened child's is when fear has crawled under their skin and stayed there. I rocked her gently, whispering over the noise of the storm. "You're safe. No one is going to hurt you. Claire Morgan is right here. The thunder can't touch you. It's just sound, just clouds talking to each other." Another flash lit the room, and she buried her face in my shoulder. I didn't care that my knees ached against the floorboards or that my back was starting to stiffen. I just kept holding her, my palms smoothing the tangled hair at the back of her head, my cheek resting against her temple. "Breathe with me," I murmured. "In and out, in and out. We can count together if you want." She didn't answer, but her breath slowly began to match mine. I told her about the storms from my own childhood, how I'd lie in bed and imagine the thunder was just giant drums in some faraway parade, how my mother would light candles and tell me the rain was washing the sky clean. Her fingers clutched at my sleeve, holding on as if those words were the only bridge between her and the rest of the world. Another gust rattled the window so violently I thought the glass might give way, and she flinched again, whispering the word a second time. "Mama," with a kind of longing that hollowed me out from the inside. I wanted to tell her it was all right to say it, that she could call me anything she needed in that moment, but I bit the words back. This wasn't about me. It was about her finding something solid in the dark. We stayed there like that for what felt like hours, but was probably minutes. The storm pacing outside, the candle I'd lit casting a trembling halo around us. I could feel the heat of her cheek through my shirt, the rapid flutter of her heartbeat slowing just enough to let her muscles loosen. I kept talking, about the sound of waves against the pier, about the gulls that would come in the morning looking for scraps, about the warmth of tea once the lights returned. She didn't speak again, but her breathing evened out, her weight resting heavier against me in a way that felt like trust. I was still holding her when the door behind me opened without a knock. The draft made the candle flicker wildly, and I turned to see Evelyn Grant standing there, her expression carved from stone. Her eyes took in the scene. Lila in my arms, my hand stroking her hair, the two of us in a small island of light surrounded by storm, and her mouth tightened. "I told you not to go digging in the past," she said, her voice as cold as the rain outside. "You have one job, Ms. Morgan. Care for her needs, nothing more. Do not encourage this attachment." I felt Lila's shoulders tense again, the fragile ease we'd built beginning to crumble under those words. I tightened my hold just enough for her to feel it. "She was frightened," I said quietly. The storm, the storm will pass," Evelyn cut in, "and so will the impulse to cling to strangers. Leave her now. She needs rest." Her gaze lingered on me a moment longer, sharp as a blade, before she turned and disappeared back into the hallway. For a long beat I didn't move. The candle hummed between us, the wax trembling toward the rim. "It's all right," I whispered to Lila once Evelyn was gone. "She can say what she likes. Claire Morgan isn't going anywhere." I didn't know if she believed me yet, but her fingers stayed curled in my sleeve until the thunder finally began to fade and the rain softened against the glass. And even as the lights flickered back to life, the echo of that one whispered word, "Mama," stayed with me, louder than any storm. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the estate wrapped in the washed-clean stillness that follows a long night of rain. The sea air crept in through the cracks in the old windows, carrying the smell of wet earth and salt. I lingered in the dining room after breakfast, stirring my tea in slow circles, watching the fine china cups tremble slightly with each step of Evelyn Grant as she moved about the room. She carried herself like someone who had memorized every creak in the floorboards, every exact position of silverware, someone who kept her world in order because chaos had once swallowed it whole. The light slanted in from the tall windows, catching in her silver hair as she arranged the mail in a neat stack at the head of the table. Lila hadn't come down for breakfast. She never did, and I found myself thinking about the way her small body had felt in my arms during the storm, how that single word she'd whispered still hummed in my mind. I had questions, too many questions. "Mrs. Grant," I began, carefully keeping my tone light, "I've been wondering about Lila's parents." Her hand froze mid-motion, the corner of an envelope caught between her fingers. She didn't look up. "There's no need for you to wonder about that." I hesitated. It might help me to understand her better, to know what she's been through. At that, she lifted her gaze, cool, precise, but with a flicker of something else buried deep. "Your understanding is not required, Miss Morgan. Only your care." The words landed with the weight of finality, but I couldn't let it go. "Forgive me, but a child who hasn't spoken in years. There must be a reason. Was it enough?" Her voice sliced through mine like a wire pulled taut. "You will not mention her parents. Not to me, not to anyone, especially not to Lila. There are rules in this house, Ms. Morgan. You will follow them." Her eyes bored into mine, sharp enough to cut, and for a moment the silence between us was as brittle as thin glass. "Rules?" I repeated softly. "Yes." She moved toward the sideboard, her heels clicking against the floor. "Meals are served at set times, 8 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon, 7 in the evening. Outside of those hours, the kitchen is closed. Lila is to spend her afternoons in her room unless she is in the garden under supervision. You will not alter her schedule. You will not bring her gifts. You will not speak to her about the past. The subject is closed." I bit back the dozen questions that rose in my throat, choosing instead to stand still and watch her as she adjusted a vase of lilies so precisely you would think the position of each petal determined the safety of the entire house. But something about the way her hand trembled on the last stem caught my attention. "You're very protective of her," I said quietly. "She's all I have," Evelyn replied, her tone tight. The words were almost tender, but then her eyes darkened again, as if she'd stepped too close to some inner cliff. "I already lost my daughter once," she said, almost to herself. It was a slip, unplanned, and I saw her realize it the instant the words left her mouth. Her lips pressed together, sealing the rest of the story inside. "You lost your daughter?" I asked gently. She looked at me as though she'd just remembered she wasn't alone in the room. "That's enough, Ms. Morgan. I expect you to respect my privacy." The conversation was over. She turned sharply toward the door, the faint scent of her lavender perfume trailing in her wake. I stayed where I was, my teacup cooling in my hands, replaying her words. Lost her daughter. The phrasing clung to me, heavy with unspoken tragedy. Later that day, I found myself in the library, one of the few rooms in the house that seemed to breathe. It was dim, the tall windows shadowed by the heavy drapes, but the scent of old books and polish gave it a strange kind of comfort. I wandered between the shelves, pretending to look for something to read, but in truth my mind was still fixed on Evelyn's slip. What could have happened to her daughter? Was it connected to Lila's silence? When the door creaked open, I stepped back into the shadow of the shelves. Evelyn entered, Not noticing me at first, she carried a small stack of letters and moved toward the desk in the far corner. That's when I saw it, the pale raised scar along the underside of her forearm. It was long, jagged, the kind of mark that didn't fade with time. My stomach tightened. I'd seen scars like that before, on patients who had survived fires, accidents, moments where heat or steel or shattered glass had bitten deep. She set the letters down and adjusted her sleeve, hiding the scar again as if it were an afterthought. But I knew it wasn't. People who wanted to hide their wounds didn't do it by accident. I stepped forward, and the faint creak of the floor made her glance up. For a moment, her eyes met mine, and I saw something raw flash there. Recognition that I'd noticed, followed quickly by the closing of a door behind them. "Do you need something, Ms. Morgan?" she asked. I shook my head slowly. "No, just looking for a book." Her gaze lingered a moment longer, as if measuring the weight of my curiosity. Then she turned and left without another word. When she was gone, I moved to the desk, my eyes skimming the letters she'd brought in. All bore the same elegant return address in black ink. Just the letter G, embossed into the paper, without a full name. A seal of some sort of family crest, pressed in wax. I didn't touch them, but something about their pristine arrangement felt deliberate, as though they were more for display than for reading. The rain had returned outside, a soft patter against the glass, and the house seemed to settle deeper into itself. I stayed in the library for a while, my thoughts circling the way Evelyn's sleeve had slipped back, the brief glimpse of that scar, the guarded way she carried her past. Whatever had happened to her daughter, it had left marks on her arm, on her voice, on this house. And I couldn't help but feel that if I wanted to reach Lila, I'd have to understand those marks, even if Evelyn Grant intended to keep them buried. The rain had a way of turning the Grant estate into a world apart, the kind of world where sound softened, the walls breathed a little deeper, and every hallway seemed longer than it should be. That evening, I had just finished straightening the linen closet when a faint sound reached me. At first, I thought it was the wind in the old chimney, that low, hollow hum the house sometimes made. But then, there was a rhythm to it, almost a pattern, something that tugged at memory. It wasn't playing exactly, more like the ghost of a melody drifting through the air, the notes too faint to be real. I followed it down the corridor, my steps light on the carpet runner, my breath held as though the sound might vanish if I exhaled too loudly. The closer I came to the east wing, the more certain I was. It was a lullaby. Not the jaunty kind you hear in a child's music box, but one of those old, aching tunes meant to soothe and break your heart at the same time. The music seemed to pull me toward the door of the locked music room, the one I'd only ever passed by, never entered. My pulse quickened as I reached the end of the hallway. The door stood ajar, just a finger's width, but enough to let out that ribbon of sound. I pushed it open a little more, slowly. Inside, the air smelled of old varnish and dust. Shafts of gray light filtered through tall, unwashed windows, and there in the middle of the room was the piano. Its black lacquer finish dulled by years of neglect, the bench sitting just far enough back to suggest no one had played it in ages. But Lila was there, small, barefoot, her white nightgown brushing the tops of her feet. She stood beside the bench, one hand resting lightly on the closed lid, her head tilted as though she were listening to music I couldn't hear. She wasn't playing. She wasn't even sitting. Just standing. I didn't want to startle her. I stepped in carefully, letting the door close behind me without a sound. "That's a beautiful piano," I said softly, though I knew she wouldn't answer. Her shoulders tightened slightly, but she didn't move away. Her fingers slid across the smooth lid, tracing patterns in the dust. And then, without meaning to, I found myself humming. The melody I'd heard just moments before, the one that had drawn me here. It wasn't perfect. My voice caught here and there, but it came out in that gentle, low way you hum to a baby in the dark when you want them to know they're safe. To my surprise, Lila didn't bolt. She turned her head just enough for me to see the side of her face, her eyes lowered, fixed on some invisible point in the wood grain. I kept humming, swaying ever so slightly, the sound a bridge between us. I used to sing this to my little brother, I murmured, barely louder than the hum itself, when the rain scared him at night. Still no words from her, but her hand stopped moving. It rested flat against the piano now, fingers spread, as if she could feel the sound in the wood. The room felt warmer somehow, though I knew the draft from the window was still there. It was a strange, delicate peace, the kind you don't dare disturb. I moved slowly toward the bench, careful to leave enough space that she wouldn't feel cornered. The last note of the lullaby faded into the stillness. Lila's breathing had slowed. For a second, I thought she might speak, but instead she simply stepped back from the piano, almost imperceptibly, and walked to the far side of the room where the light from the window fell in a pale square on the floor. She crouched there, drawing something invisible in the dust with her fingertip. I didn't follow her. Instead, I turned my attention to the piano, and that's when I saw it, on the closed lid, in the thick layer of dust. Two clear impressions, small handprints, not smudges from brushing past, but deliberate, pressed down firmly, side by side. The edges were soft, but the shapes were perfect. Something about them sent a shiver through me. It wasn't just that they were there, it was that they were fresh. I could see the faint crumble of disturbed dust, the tiny ridges where fingers had pressed down. I glanced toward Lila. She was watching me now, her wide eyes unreadable in the dim light. Her hands were clean, but I couldn't shake the image of her standing there alone, pressing her palms into the piano as if trying to draw something out of it. I reached out, letting my own fingers hover just above the prints without touching them. "You've been here before," I said softly, more to myself than to her. "You've touched this piano." No answer, of course, but her gaze didn't waver. I sat down on the bench and, without thinking too much about it, opened the lid just enough to press a single key. The note rang out, pure but lonely in the empty room. Lila's eyes flickered, something quick, something almost like recognition, before she turned away and slipped out the door, as silently as she had appeared. The door eased shut behind her, leaving me with the echo of that note and the outline of her small handprints in the dust. They felt like a message, though I couldn't yet read it. But one thing I knew, Lila and that piano shared a secret, and maybe, just maybe, the song she remembered was the key to it. The bell over the cafe door gave its little jingle as I stepped inside, shaking the cold from my coat. The air smelled of coffee grounds and baked cinnamon, a welcome change from the scentless chill of the Grant estate. It was the sort of place where the booths had seen years of elbows leaning on them, where conversations were meant to be overheard, and where outsiders, like me, drew a glance or two before the locals decided whether I was worth their notice. I took a seat at the counter rather than a booth, figuring it might be easier to listen without looking like I was trying. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a kind smile, slid a menu in front of me before I could ask. "Coffee or something stronger?" she asked, voice carrying the kind of humor that comes from knowing most of the people she serves. "Coffee's perfect," I said, returning the smile. "Black, please." She poured without a word, leaving the pot on the warmer and drifting back to the other end of the counter where two men in heavy work coats were already deep in a quiet conversation. I tried not to stare, but it didn't take long for the first bits of gossip to drift over. The name Grant came up like a pebble tossed into still water. Small ripples, but everyone heard it. Shame about her daughter, one man murmured. I wrapped my hands around the coffee cup and kept my gaze on the steam. Could have had the whole world ahead of her, the other replied, his voice low. She was a pianist, you know. Big concerts in the city, name in the papers. Folks used to say she had the kind of hands that could make you cry without knowing why. My grip on the cup tightened. I didn't need to ask who they meant. Died in that wreck, didn't she? The first man asked. The second nodded. Both of them, her and her husband. Only Evelyn came out of it alive. Barely. Rumor was they were driving back from some recital upstate. Car went off the road in the rain. He took a sip of coffee, then added almost reluctantly, some folks say it wasn't just the weather. That made the first man glance around the cafe, lowering his voice further. You mean the talk about someone running them off the road? I'm not saying I believe it, the second replied quickly, but it's a strange thing, the way the whole story got quiet so fast. One minute, the police are asking questions. The next, it's all tidied up as an accident. Evelyn never spoke about it again. Not in public, anyway. The waitress returned to refill their cups, shooting them both a look that said she'd heard enough of that line of talk. But the seed had already planted itself in my mind, and it refused to stay still. I stirred my coffee, more for something to do than because it needed it. My thoughts flicked back to the locked music room, to Lila's silent presence there, to those small handprints in the dust, a mother who was a pianist, a daughter who wouldn't speak, and a grandmother who wouldn't let the past be named. By the time I paid for my coffee and stood to leave, I had decided to take the long way back. The streets of the town were quiet, the kind of quiet where you could hear your own boots on the wet pavement. I passed a row of shuttered shops, a florist's window stacked with buckets of chrysanthemums, and finally came to the newsstand. It was there I saw him, a man leaning against the side of the stand, notebook in hand, pen tapping idly against the page. He was in his late 40s maybe, hair a little too long for the sharpness of his coat, eyes the restless kind that measured you in an instant. You're the new one up at the Grant place, he said as I approached, not bothering to make it a question. I hesitated, weighing my words. Claire Morgan, I'm just helping with the family. He smiled, though it wasn't exactly warm. Helping, that's one way to put it. I'm Tom Riley, local paper. He held up the notebook like a badge. We don't often see a nurse from a fishing town settle into the biggest house on the hill. Gets people curious. I didn't take the bait. It's work, that's all. Sure, he said lightly, but work for Evelyn Grant isn't the same as work for anyone else. She's a private woman, very private. And when someone new moves in, well, people notice. They start to wonder. Wonder about what? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. His smile thinned. About why she needs you now, after all these years. About what's really going on in that house. He clicked his pen closed, tucking it into his coat. Some stories never die, Miss Morgan. They just go quiet until the right person comes along to wake them up. With that, he tipped his head in a kind of farewell and walked off down the street, leaving me with the uneasy feeling that he hadn't just been fishing for a quote. He'd been warning me. By the time I reached the long driveway to the estate, the sky had clouded over again, heavy with the promise of rain. The gates loomed ahead, their iron bars cold and unyielding. Somewhere beyond them, Lila was in her room, Evelyn was keeping her watch, and the locked doors of the Grant family's past waited, patient as stone. I didn't know yet whether Tom Riley was a threat, an ally, or just another voice in the chorus of town gossip. But I knew one thing. I couldn't afford to be careless. The more I learned, the more I understood that whatever had happened to Lila's parents wasn't just a tragedy. It was a wound that had been stitched shut in haste, one that might tear open again if I wasn't careful. And if it did, I had a feeling it would take more than a nurse's skill to put it right. The afternoon had the kind of stillness that felt unnatural for such a large house. Even the ticking of the old hallway clock seemed muffled, like the air itself was holding its breath. I had finished the morning's routine, Lila's breakfast tray, the quiet hour in her room where she turned her face toward the window and ignored me entirely, the endless dusting of rooms no one used, and found myself in the upstairs study. The study was one of the few places Evelyn rarely entered while I worked. It smelled faintly of old paper and lemon polish, with tall windows that looked out over the bare winter trees. The desk was massive, carved from some heavy dark wood, its drawers neat to the point of obsession, except for one on the far left. That one stuck slightly when I pulled at it, the metal catch resisting just enough to make me curious. I told myself I was only looking for a fresh notepad. That's what I told myself as I gave the drawer one careful tug, then another. It opened just an inch before something inside caught, but in that inch of space I saw the corner of a photograph, the kind of old print where the colors had softened with time, the gloss dulled to a gentle sheen. I shouldn't have. I knew I shouldn't have. But my fingers slipped into that gap and worked the photograph free. It was Lila, younger, maybe 5 or 6, her hair loose around her shoulders, a pale pink dress that seemed to float around her like petals. She stood between a man and a woman, both of them elegant in a way that cameras loved. The man's hand rested gently on her shoulder. The woman's hand, long, graceful fingers, curved around a microphone as if it belonged there. And behind them, blurred by the shallow focus, a grand piano. The three of them stood on a stage, smiling in that unguarded way that tells you they believed the moment would last forever. I stared longer than I should have. There was so much warmth in that image, so much light, and the knowledge that it had all been extinguished made it harder to breathe. "Claire!" I froze, the photograph still in my hand. Evelyn stood in the doorway, her figure framed in the pale afternoon light. I couldn't tell how long she'd been there, but the way her eyes fixed on the photograph told me she'd seen enough. "I was looking for... Put it back." Her voice was flat, but there was a tremor beneath it. I slid the photograph onto the desk, my fingers reluctant to let go. "It's a beautiful picture." Evelyn stepped into the room, crossing to the desk with a slow, deliberate pace. Her eyes didn't leave the photo. She reached for it, her hands steady, but the tightness around her mouth gave her away. "You shouldn't go through my things," she said. I wasn't trying to pry." My voice was low, almost apologetic, but I couldn't leave it at that. "Evelyn, Lila should see this. She should remember her parents. Keeping it locked away is protecting her." Evelyn's gaze snapped to mine, sharp as broken glass. "From what? From love? From knowing she was happy once? From the pain of losing it again?" she snapped, the veneer of composure cracking for the first time since I'd met her. "You think I don't understand what she's lost? You think I don't know what it's like to look at a face you'll never see again?" Her voice wavered, and for a moment she looked away, toward the window. The light caught her profile, the faint ridge of a scar along her jawline, one I'd never noticed until now. "She was so small," Evelyn said finally, her tone softer. "Too small to understand. And when she cried for them, God help me, Claire, I didn't know what to do except shut the doors, close the windows, lock every reminder away before it tore her apart." I took a step closer. "But Evelyn, she's already apart. She's locked in that room, not speaking, not living. The silence isn't protecting her. It's keeping her there." Evelyn's eyes narrowed, but there was no real anger in it now. Only exhaustion. "Do you think I haven't tried? That I haven't sat outside her door and begged her to speak to me? She looks through me, Claire, as if I'm just another wall in her way. I wanted to tell her that maybe she was, that maybe her rules and her silences were the very bricks of that wall. But something in her expression stopped me, a rawness I hadn't expected, like the faint outline of grief that had never been given the chance to heal. She reached for the photograph again, her thumb brushing the corner, and for a moment her face softened. She traced the outline of the woman's face, the pianist's face, so lightly it was as if she feared the image might smudge. She was my daughter, Evelyn whispered, more to herself than to me. My only child, and I thought I could keep her safe. I thought, if I just held everything together, if I made the rules and kept the world at bay, I could stop the worst from happening. Her voice broke on the last word. I waited, knowing that if I said too much, she might retreat back behind that wall she'd built. Evelyn set the photo down carefully, almost reverently. Then, with a small shake of her head, she looked at me, not with her usual guarded distance, but with something that was almost pleading. If you knew the truth, Claire, her voice dropped to a whisper. If you knew the truth, you wouldn't be asking me to open those doors. The weight of her words settled between us, heavy and unyielding. There was a story here, one she'd guarded with the same ferocity she used to guard Lila. A story that might explain the locked drawers, the strict rules, the fear in her eyes when I got too close to the past. But before I could speak, she turned away, the conversation over as swiftly as it had begun. She took the photograph with her, leaving me alone in the study with the fading light and the faint scent of lemon polish. And for the first time since I'd come to the Grant estate, I felt certain of two things. Evelyn wasn't just protecting Lila from grief. She was protecting her from something else entirely. Something she believed was still out there. Something she feared enough to keep buried at any cost. I began to notice the patterns in the house, subtle, almost invisible routines that repeated day after day, like the winding gears of a clock that had been ticking far too long without pause. Breakfast arrived on a tray at precisely 8:30. Lila's curtains were always drawn at the same angle. Evelyn's footsteps passed down the hallway at noon exactly, slow and measured, as if she were marking the hours herself. And Lila stayed in her room, always. It had been weeks now. My early attempts at conversation, at coaxing her to read or draw, or even look at me, had failed. She wasn't cold or angry, just absent, her mind fixed somewhere far from this house, from me, from everything. But I'd been thinking about her drawing of the bird in the cage with the open door, and I wondered if the lock on her silence wasn't as permanent as it seemed. Music. I don't know why it hadn't occurred to me sooner. Maybe because I hadn't wanted to overstep. Evelyn had her rules and the house itself seemed built from them, but the memory of that closed music room, of the dust on the piano lid with the shape of small handprints, wouldn't let me go. So that morning, when I brought Lila her breakfast, I left something behind. Not words, not questions. Just a small portable speaker on her desk, beside the untouched stack of books. "I'll leave this here," I said lightly, keeping my voice free of expectation. "If you'd like, I could play something while you eat." She didn't answer, of course. She was sitting in her usual spot by the window, knees drawn up, her gaze fixed on the skeletal branches swaying in the wind. I tapped my phone, and soft piano music filled the room. Gentle, unhurried notes, nothing jarring or loud. The melody was one I'd found on a whim, something I used to listen to on night shifts at the hospital to steady my mind. I set the tray down, moved toward the door. Halfway there, I thought I heard the faintest change in her breathing, like she'd drawn in a sharper breath without meaning to. I didn't look back. I didn't want her to feel watched. When I returned an hour later for the tray, the speaker was still on. The breakfast had been half eaten, and though Lila was back in her corner, her toes were tapping against the carpet. The next day I tried again, a different piece, this one with a lilting rhythm that swayed like slow waves against a shore. I stayed in the doorway this time, pretending to fuss with the curtains, and then, so softly I almost doubted it, I heard it. A hum, just 2 or 3 notes, barely there, like she was testing the sound in her own throat. I froze. It wasn't much, just a fragile thread of melody, but it was something. The first sound I'd ever heard from her that wasn't the rustle of movement or the scrape of a chair. I let the music keep playing, my heart in my mouth, and I didn't react, didn't praise her, didn't move toward her. If she felt it was safe to hum once, maybe she would again. That evening, after my duties were done, I passed the music room. The door was cracked open, though it was usually locked. Candlelight spilled into the hallway, soft and golden. Inside, Evelyn sat at the grand piano. Her back was to me, her shoulders straight, her hair catching the light in threads of silver. Her fingers moved slowly over the keys, drawing out a melody so familiar my breath caught. It was the same tune I'd played for Lila that morning. Every note was careful, deliberate, filled with something I couldn't quite name. Regret, maybe, or memory. I leaned against the doorframe, hidden in shadow, listening. Evelyn's playing wasn't flawless. There were hesitations, small stumbles, like her hands remembered, but her mind was elsewhere. When she reached the last note, she let it linger in the air. For a long moment she just sat there, her fingers resting on the keys, her head slightly bowed. Then slowly she closed the fallboard over the piano and blew out the candle. The room went dark. The door shut. I stood there long after she was gone, the melody still echoing in my head, wondering if Evelyn even knew she'd been playing the first bridge I'd managed to build to Lila. And more than that, wondering why she knew it at all. The morning began like any other. Gray light seeping through the long, sheer curtains of the parlor, the distant sound of gulls over the water, Evelyn's slow, deliberate footsteps overhead. I had just finished tidying the sitting room when something small, delicate, and out of place caught my eye on the mantelpiece. It was a music box. I was certain it hadn't been there yesterday. The box was made of pale wood, the kind that had aged into a warm honey color, its corners smoothed by time. Tiny inlaid mother-of-pearl flowers curved along the lid, their petals dulled with age. A key protruded from the side, though the metal was tarnished, as if it hadn't been wound in years. I reached for it, my fingers brushing away a faint layer of dust. When I lifted the lid, a tune began to play, soft, halting, as if the mechanism had forgotten the melody and was trying to recall it. It was a simple lullaby, gentle and sweet, and I felt a strange heaviness in my chest. I'd heard it before, somewhere. Inside, instead of the usual little dancer or figurine, there was a shallow compartment lined with faded blue velvet, and tucked against one corner, barely visible, was a thin envelope, sealed and brittle with age. I picked it up carefully. My breath caught when I saw the handwriting, elegant, looping cursive in deep black ink. To my darling Lila, for when she is ready. The return address was from Boston, the date written in the corner. I froze. It was the very day of the accident. My pulse began to race. This was from Lila's mother. There was no doubt. And for some reason, Evelyn had kept it here, hidden in a music box on a mantel no one touched. I turned the envelope over in my hands. The seal was intact, the paper slightly brittle beneath my fingertips. The urge to read it was almost unbearable. Maybe it would explain something. Why Lila had retreated from the world. Why Evelyn's eyes sometimes darkened when music filled the air. Why this house seemed to breathe in memories and exhale silence. But it wasn't mine to read. I set it back in the velvet-lined compartment, then took it again. My fingers closed around it like it might vanish if I let go. All through my morning chores, I carried it with me, tucked deep in my pocket, feeling its weight like a question I couldn't answer. What if the truth inside could help Lila? What if it could hurt her? Evelyn had said not to stir the past, but Evelyn had also built this suffocating cage of silence, and the cage was killing any spark left in that child. By noon, I was pacing my small room, the envelope resting on my bed. I told myself I would give it to Evelyn. That was the right thing. It was hers to decide. But the image of Lila, standing alone by the window, humming those few notes, tugged at me. Maybe she had been waiting for someone to give her a key to whatever door had been shut 2 years ago. In the end, I didn't knock on Evelyn's door. Instead, I went to the study where Lila's sketchbooks were stacked. She kept them neatly, tucked into a corner by the tall bookshelf. I slid the envelope between the pages of a nearly full album, the one I'd seen her carry now and then, flipping through her own drawings like they were memories she was allowed to keep. When I closed the book, the letter was invisible, hidden among pencil lines and watercolors. Later that afternoon, I brought tea and left the album on the low table in the sitting room. I didn't linger. I simply went about my work, passing through the hall once or twice, not looking directly at her. The third time I came by, Lila was there, barefoot, her hair falling loose over her shoulders. She didn't glance at me, but I saw her hand rest on the album's cover. She picked it up, hesitated, then pressed it to her chest. Without a word, she walked back toward the staircase, the soft pad of her footsteps fading into the stillness of the upper floor. I stood there a long moment, the empty tea tray in my hands, my heart pounding. I didn't know if she'd found the letter yet, or if she would that night, or a week from now. But for the first time, I felt I'd placed something in her world that didn't come from Evelyn's carefully measured control. Something that was hers alone to open. And as the house settled into its evening hush, I realized I was holding my breath, waiting to see if the truth inside that envelope would be the thing that set her free, or the thing that broke her completely. The morning began with a sound I hadn't heard in this house before. Footsteps in the hall that were neither Evelyn's brisk, clipped pace, nor the heavy tread of the staff. They were soft, hesitant, almost searching. When I opened my door, I saw her. Lila stood in the middle of the corridor, still in her nightdress, her hair a tumble of pale gold over her shoulders. She clutched her sketchbook to her chest, the same one where I'd hidden the letter. Her bare toes curled against the carpet, like she wasn't sure whether to move forward or retreat. Her eyes found mine. There was something new there, still guarded, but lit with a strange, unsteady determination. Her lips parted, and in a voice so soft I almost thought I'd imagined it, she said, "Garden?" For a heartbeat, I couldn't move. My mind went back to every day I'd passed her door, every time she'd turned away at my approach, every silent meal where she'd kept her gaze fixed on her plate. And now, one word, a request. "Yes," I said, my voice gentle, careful not to frighten her. "We can go to the garden." She didn't smile, but she didn't turn away either. I told her I'd wait for her downstairs, then hurried to dress and pull on a sweater. Outside, the wind carried the salty tang of the sea, the sky pale with early spring light. The Grant garden stretched behind the house, a wide expanse of manicured hedges and gravel paths that curved toward a wilder edge where roses would bloom in summer. When Lila appeared at the back door, she wore a simple blue cardigan over her dress. She clutched that sketchbook still, holding it the way some children hold a stuffed toy. I didn't ask if she'd read the letter. I didn't need to. We stepped onto the terrace. The air was cool with that crisp bite that makes you breathe deeper. Lila's shoes crunched lightly on the gravel as she followed me down the first path. Her head turned slightly, her eyes scanning the trees, the neat rows of flower beds still bare from winter. "This way," I said softly, leading her toward a wooden bench under a tall willow. I remembered the first day I'd arrived, how I'd stood here alone, sensing the quiet weight of this place, how even the flowers had seemed muted. Now the early buds were breaking open, spots of green against the gray. Lila paused by a patch of earth where snowdrops had begun to bloom. She crouched down, touching the white petals lightly with her fingertips. I stayed a few steps back, letting her have the space, letting her move at her own rhythm. "You can come out here whenever you like," I said after a while. "It's yours too, you know." She didn't look up, but I saw the faintest nod. We walked the path slowly, her pace unhurried, almost tentative. I could feel her listening, to the rustle of leaves, to the distant gulls, to the hum of life beyond the walls she'd stayed behind for so long. When we reached the farthest corner of the garden, where the hedges gave way to a low stone wall, she stopped. From here you could see the town spread out below, the church steeple, the fishing boats bobbing in the harbor. Her grip on the sketchbook loosened. She pressed it against the wall, flipped it open, and began to draw. I stayed quiet, watching the way her small hand moved, the way she glanced from the view to the page and back again. It struck me that she wasn't just sketching the town. She was capturing the horizon, the line where the sea met the sky. We stayed there for what felt like a long time, the wind moving softly through the garden. Eventually, she closed the book and turned toward the house. Her steps were lighter now, her shoulders not quite as tense. When we reached the terrace, she hesitated before going inside, looking over her shoulder once more at the open air. "Tomorrow," she whispered. It wasn't a question. I nodded. "Tomorrow." As we stepped back into the house, I glanced up, some instinct drawing my eyes to the tall windows above the terrace. And there, behind the glass, stood Evelyn Grant. Her hand was pressed to the window frame. Her expression was not the cold mask I'd come to know, but something rawer, unguarded. Her eyes glistened. Even from here, I could see the faint tremble in her chin. For a moment, I thought she might come down, open the door, step into the garden herself, but she didn't move. She stayed there, a figure framed in glass, watching the granddaughter she hadn't touched in 2 years take her first steps back into the world. And as I guided Lila inside, the image stayed with me. Evelyn, still upstairs, tears on her face, choosing to watch from behind the glass instead of walking into the sunlight. It happened on a Thursday morning, the kind of morning when the light seemed softer than usual, when the air smelled faintly of sea salt and cut grass. I had just coaxed Lila into the garden for the third day in a row, slow, steady steps toward a world she had avoided for 2 years. She carried her sketchbook, and we were headed toward the willow again, the place that had become her small safe corner. We had barely reached the middle path when I heard it, a man's voice, sharp, echoing through the stillness of the garden. "Lila! Lila Grant! Is it true? Is it true what they say about your parents?" I froze. The sound didn't belong here. It wasn't one of the gardeners, not one of the staff. My eyes darted toward the high hedge near the back gate, and there he was, a man with a camera slung around his neck, his suit rumpled, his tie hanging loose. His eyes were bright with the kind of hunger I'd only seen in people chasing a story. "Who are you?" I called, stepping instinctively in front of Lila. He ignored me. His gaze was locked on the girl behind me. "They say it wasn't an accident, that someone in your family—" "Stop!" My voice cracked like a whip. "Leave now, or I'll call the police." But the damage was already done. Lila's hands trembled against her sketchbook, her face draining of color. Her lips moved without sound, her eyes wide with a terror I hadn't seen in weeks. She backed away from me, step after step, until she turned and ran, her small feet pounding the gravel as she bolted toward the house. The man tried to push further in, but two of the groundskeepers had seen him now. They moved quickly, grabbing his arms, dragging him toward the gate as he shouted over his shoulder, "The world will know the truth. They'll know what really happened that night." His voice carried until the gate slammed shut. By the time I reached the terrace, Lila was gone, vanished back inside, the door swinging behind her. I called her name, but there was no answer. The house felt suddenly colder, emptier. I climbed the stairs two at a time, heading for her room. She had locked the door. I pressed my palm to the wood. "Lila, it's me. It's Claire. You're safe. No one can hurt you here." Silence. Then the faintest sound of something sliding, her sketchbook being pushed under the bed maybe, or the small creak of floorboards as she curled into her corner. The rest of the day she didn't come out. Lunch sat untouched. The window curtains were drawn. The only sign she was inside was the muffled scrape of a chair leg moving once, then silence again. It wasn't long before Evelyn appeared. She didn't knock. She didn't ask if I was all right. She found me in the upstairs hall, my hand still on Lila's doorknob, my heart sinking with every quiet minute that passed. "What happened?" she demanded, her voice like the edge of broken glass. I told her. I told her about the man, about the words he'd shouted, about the way Lila had frozen and then fled. Evelyn's eyes narrowed as I spoke, and I could feel the accusation forming before she even said it. "You should have been watching her more closely," she said. "This intrusion never would have happened if you had been doing your job." I felt my cheeks flush with anger. I was with her. I was right there. "He came out of nowhere. He knew things." Her voice rose. "You were brought here to protect her, not to let strangers hurl poison into her ears." I swallowed hard, holding her gaze. "And what poison is that, Evelyn? What is it you've been so desperate for her not to hear?" For a moment I thought she might tell me. Her eyes flickered. Pain, anger, something unguarded just for a heartbeat. But then the shutters came down again. "You will not speak to her about this. And if you cannot keep her safe from the outside world, perhaps you shouldn't be here at all." The words landed like a stone in my chest. That night I sat on the floor outside Lila's door, listening to the steady hush of the sea beyond the windows. I told her stories through the wood, about my father's garden when I was little, about the way the wind smells before a summer storm, about the first time I learned to ride a bike. I didn't know if she was listening. I didn't know if any of it would reach her. It was near midnight when I felt it, the faintest tug at my sleeve. My head snapped up, and there she was. Lila stood in the doorway, her hair mussed, her eyes rimmed red from crying. She didn't speak at first, just stared at me with that same look she'd had in the garden weeks ago, when she'd asked for the garden for the first time. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Don't go." Her hand found mine, small, cold, trembling, and held on with surprising strength. "I'm not going anywhere," I said, my throat tightening. "Not unless you tell me to." She nodded once, as if sealing some fragile, secret pact between us. Then she turned and padded back into her room, leaving the door open just enough for me to see the edge of her bed, the sketchbook on the floor beside it. I sat there for a long while, listening to her breathing even out, holding on to the warmth of her small hand in mine, and knowing that whatever Evelyn thought, whatever the world outside believed, I had just been given the clearest truth of all. She didn't want me to leave, and I wouldn't. The rain began before dawn. One of those relentless coastal downpours that blurred the horizon and made the sea and sky one endless sheet of gray. By the time I came downstairs, the sound of it was everywhere, hammering against the tall windows, racing through the gutters, drumming on the glass roof of the conservatory. The world outside looked washed away, as if the town itself had been erased. Evelyn was already awake. I found her standing in the music room doorway, her back straight, her hands folded in front of her. She wasn't looking at the piano. She was watching the rain. For a moment, I thought she might tell me to leave, the way she always did when I caught her here. But instead, she said, without turning, "You can come in." The air in the room smelled faintly of polish and dust, as though it hadn't been truly lived in for years. I stepped closer, my shoes sinking into the deep Persian rug, my eyes drawn to the piano. The lid was down, the bench perfectly aligned, no sheet music in sight, just an immaculate silent shrine. Evelyn's voice came low, almost lost beneath the storm. "Do you know why this room stays closed most of the time?" I hesitated. "Because it reminds Lila of her parents." A sharp breath, almost a laugh, escaped her. "It reminds me, Claire, every single day, of what I did and what I can never undo." Something in her tone made my chest tighten. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the reflection of herself in the window, her face a pale blur against the rain. "I've heard all sorts of stories in town," I said carefully, "about the accident, about the night you lost them." Her hands clenched together, the knuckles white. "Yes, I'm sure they have their versions, but there's only one truth, and it's worse than any rumor." She drew in a long breath, and when she spoke again, the words came like a confession dragged from deep inside. "I was driving." The storm outside seemed to swell with her voice. It was late. We just left the concert hall. My daughter had performed brilliantly that night. We were tired, but she was laughing, teasing me about my terrible singing along to the radio. Lila was in the back seat, humming. I remember, I remember glancing in the rearview mirror to smile at her. Her voice cracked. And in that single second, I didn't see the car pulling out from the side street. We swerved. I overcorrected. There was the sound of glass shattering, the smell of gasoline, and then nothing but firelight on the road. She gripped the edge of the piano as though it were the only thing holding her upright. "They told me it wasn't my fault, that the other driver had been drinking, but they weren't the ones who saw my daughter's hand go still or heard my granddaughter's scream fade into silence. They weren't the ones who woke up in the hospital knowing two people I loved more than life were gone. And I was the one who had been behind the wheel." I stepped closer, unsure if she would pull away. "Evelyn, you couldn't have known." She turned then, her eyes bright with unshed tears, but fierce, almost angry. "Don't you see? I do know. I know every moment. I replay it 1,000 times a day. That's why I keep her locked away, why I try to control every breath she takes, because if anything else happens to her, it will be because I failed again, and I will not survive that twice." For a long moment, the only sound was the rain hammering against the windows. My heart ached, not just for Evelyn, but for the girl upstairs who had lived 2 years in the shadow of this guilt. And then, a sound made both of us turn. From the hallway, soft footsteps, and a voice. "I heard you." Lila stood in the doorway, her hair loose, her eyes wide and wet, her small body framed by the dim light of the corridor. Her voice was trembling but steady enough to form words. Real words, not whispers or fragments. "You weren't bad, Grandma. You, you were just looking at me." Evelyn's hand flew to her mouth, her breath catching in something between a sob and a gasp. "Lila." The girl stepped into the room, barefoot, her nightgown brushing the tops of her feet. She looked from her grandmother to me, and for the first time, her eyes held something other than fear. Something almost like resolve. "Can we go to the music room?" she asked. I blinked. "We are in the music room, sweetheart." She shook her head, a tiny smile flickering at the corners of her mouth. "Not this one. The little one. Upstairs." Evelyn's brow furrowed in confusion, but I knew what she meant. The small practice room I had found once, locked with dust on the stool and a child-sized keyboard in the corner. I glanced at Evelyn, waiting for her to object, to shut this moment down, but she didn't. She only nodded, her voice breaking as she said, "Yes, yes, we can." And as Lila slipped her hand into mine, the storm outside seemed to soften, just enough for me to believe that maybe this was the first true step towards something neither of them had dared hope for. The small practice room upstairs had always felt like an afterthought, a narrow space tucked between two guest bedrooms, with sloped ceilings and a single round window that framed the restless gray of the ocean. It smelled faintly of cedar and old paper, and the walls were lined with shelves stacked with worn sheet music, the pages curled at the edges. The little keyboard stood in the corner, its keys yellowed with age. Dust still lingered on the stool, but the moment Lila stepped inside, she walked straight to it, her bare feet silent against the wooden floor. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look at me or at Evelyn. She simply sat down, small hands resting lightly on her lap, eyes fixed on the instrument. I half expected her to freeze the moment her fingers touched the keys. For 2 years she had hidden from the world, flinched from sound, closed herself off like a bird folding its wings. But now she reached for a thin folder of sheet music that had been left on the stand, flipping until she found a single faded page. When she placed it in front of her, Evelyn let out a sharp, audible breath. "That was her mother's," Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling. I leaned closer. The title was written in elegant script, Claire de Lune. The corners of the paper were worn soft, as though handled countless times. Lila's mother had been a pianist. This was not just music, it was memory, flesh and bone. Evelyn took a step forward, but I shook my head gently. This moment was fragile, and even love could shatter it if pressed too quickly. Lila's small fingers hovered above the keys. For a heartbeat she sat utterly still, the rain outside softening to a distant murmur, the house itself holding its breath. Then she began to play. The first notes were hesitant, uneven, like a voice long unused. But as she went on, the melody began to flow, gathering strength, each chord carrying a warmth that filled the room. She swayed slightly with the rhythm, eyes half closed, and the faintest smile ghosted across her lips. I had heard Claire de Lune 100 times before, but never like this. Here in this small room where the sea whispered against the shore and the light caught in her hair, the music sounded like a homecoming. Evelyn's hand found the edge of the doorframe, her knuckles white. Her breath was shallow and I could see the battle in her eyes, not to stop the tears, but to let them fall freely. I didn't fight mine. They came hot and fast, blurring the little figure at the keyboard until she was only a shape in the glow of the lamp. Halfway through, the melody swelled, and something in Lila's expression shifted. She lifted her chin, her gaze flicking toward the round window, as if playing for someone beyond the glass, someone she still believed could hear her. And I realized she was. She was playing for her mother. When the final notes faded, the silence was so deep it felt sacred. The room seemed changed, as if the music had washed the dust from its corners, breathed life into its stillness. Lila's hand stayed on the keys for a moment longer before she let them fall to her lap. She didn't turn around. She just sat there, breathing softly, as if afraid to break whatever had just been mended inside her. It was Evelyn who moved first. She crossed the room slowly, each step deliberate, until she stood beside her granddaughter. She didn't say a word. She simply laid a trembling hand on Lila's shoulder. I expected Lila to flinch. Instead, she reached up and placed her own small hand over her grandmother's. And then she turned, first to Evelyn, then to me. Her eyes were brighter than I had ever seen them, not from tears alone, but from something fiercer: trust. "I want you both to be my moms," she said, the words soft but certain. I felt my breath catch. Evelyn's lips parted, but no sound came. For a long, suspended moment, the three of us just looked at each other, the broken pieces of a family that somehow, in this quiet room above the roaring sea, had found a way to fit together again. I didn't answer with words. I didn't need to. I simply stepped forward, and Evelyn and I each wrapped an arm around Lila, the three of us folding into an embrace that smelled of cedar and rain and something new, something almost like freedom. Outside, the ocean kept its endless rhythm, but inside this little room, time had stopped, and I knew we would remember this moment for the rest of our lives. The afternoon light was soft and gold, slanting through the lace curtains in my small bedroom at the far end of the second floor. I had meant to rest after lunch, just a short moment to let my thoughts settle. But instead, I found myself sitting on the edge of the bed, holding an unopened envelope in my hands. Not a letter from the Grants, not anything to do with this house, but from my old bank back home. I didn't have to open it to know what it was. The weight of it in my palm was enough to pull me straight back to the cramped kitchen of my little cottage, the one where my husband Daniel and I had sat over stacks of bills, trying to stretch numbers until they made sense. That was before the hospital, before the endless nights of alarms and tubes and waiting for a doctor to give us some impossible miracle. Daniel had been gone for 3 years now, 3 years of working double shifts, 3 years of trying to care for my father in that drafty little house, 3 years of pretending I wasn't drowning. And yet, even here, in this place that felt like another world, the weight of that past followed me. I didn't notice the knock at first. It was soft, almost hesitant. When I finally looked up, Evelyn was in the doorway, one hand resting lightly on the frame. She was wearing one of her perfectly pressed cardigans, but her hair was looser than usual, and her eyes, usually so guarded, were open, curious. "Claire," she said, her voice low, "I've been thinking. We've all been through a great deal these last months, and I realize I've never asked you much about yourself." The instinct to smile politely and deflect rose immediately, but something in her tone stopped me. It wasn't a demand or a test. It was an invitation. I set the envelope aside. "There isn't much to tell," I began, then stopped, because that wasn't true. There was too much to tell. I took a breath, and for the first time in years, I let the words out without trying to soften them. I was married. His name was Daniel. He was a carpenter, and he built our kitchen table by hand, the same one where we ate every meal together. When he got sick, it was sudden, brutal. The bills, and they just kept coming, and I thought I could handle it. But when he passed, I was left with nothing but debt and a house I could barely keep warm. My father's health was failing, and my voice faltered. I was terrified, Evelyn. Not just of losing the people I loved, but of not being enough for them while they were still here. She didn't interrupt. She didn't try to tell me it was all right or that I'd done my best. She simply sat down beside me, folding her hands in her lap, her gaze fixed on the floor as though the weight of what I'd said belonged to both of us now. "I took this job because I needed the money," I admitted, my throat tightening. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being about that. Lila, she reminded me of myself after my mother died, alone in a room full of silence. I couldn't just treat her like a task. Evelyn turned her head then, her eyes meeting mine. They were wet, though her voice was steady. "And you think I could?" she asked quietly. I shook my head. "I think you were protecting yourself the only way you knew how, just like I was. But it's different now, isn't it? She's different, and so are we." For a moment she didn't speak. Then very softly she said, "I don't want you to leave, Claire. Not when we've come this far. Stay, not as a nurse, not as an employee, but as family." The word lingered in the air between us. Family. It had been years since anyone had said it to me without obligation or pity. I opened my mouth to answer, but before I could, there was a light patter of footsteps in the hall, and Lila appeared in the doorway. She was holding something close to her chest, a piece of paper that looked slightly crumpled at the edges. She didn't say a word, just crossed the room and handed it to me. It was a drawing, not one of her earlier ones, with hesitant lines and empty spaces. This was full, filled to the edges with color and life. 3 figures stood side by side, hands linked. One was small, with a bright yellow dress and hair the color of honey. The other 2, taller, were drawn in the same gentle style. One with hair like mine, one with Evelyn's silver bun. Behind them was a garden, and above them, a sun that seemed almost too big for the page. My throat closed. Evelyn leaned in to look, her hand trembling slightly as she reached out to trace the lines. Lila's eyes searched our faces, waiting. I set the drawing gently on my lap, then opened my arms. She stepped into them without hesitation. Evelyn moved closer too, her hand resting on Lila's back. And for the first time, it didn't feel like 2 separate worlds trying to meet in the middle. It felt like one whole thing, solid and warm. We stayed like that for a long time, the 3 of us in a small room heavy with the smell of sea air and the faint scent of Evelyn's lavender perfume. Outside, the gulls wheeled over the cliffs, their cries sharp and bright in the late afternoon. I thought about the envelope on the bed, the debts, the past, the things that had seemed so impossible to escape, and for the first time I realized maybe I wasn't escaping them at all. Maybe I was simply building something stronger in their place. When Lila finally pulled back, she pointed at the drawing again, tapping each figure in turn. "Us," she said. It wasn't just a statement, it was a promise. A year can pass slowly if you are waiting for something, but it can also pass in the blink of an eye when you're living inside it, moment after moment, watching the world open up like a flower you'd almost given up on. That's how it felt with Lila. One season bled into the next, and before we could even mark the days on the calendar, a year had gone by since the day she first stepped into the garden after 2 years of shadows. Now, on most mornings, the house wakes not to silence, but to the sound of a violin tuning, or Lila's piano notes drifting down the hallway, mixing with the smell of coffee and toast. She's not the little ghost in the window anymore. She's a girl with her hair pulled into a neat braid, shoes polished, books in her bag, and a quick hug for me before she rushes to catch the school bus. She comes home with stories, so many stories, about the girls in her class, the teacher who always wears funny earrings, and the boy who once smuggled a frog into music practice. Evelyn says the house has grown louder. She says it with a kind of mock exasperation, but I catch her smiling when she thinks no one's looking. The corridors don't echo the way they used to. They're full of footsteps, laughter, the clatter of chairs being pulled out for dinner. The windows are never shuttered anymore. They're open to the wind, to the voices from the garden, to the smells of baking bread and the faint sweetness of lilies Evelyn insists on keeping by the front door. And music, always music. Lila plays in the evenings, sometimes for herself, sometimes for us, and now, more often than not, for an audience. A few months ago, she joined the school ensemble, and her first concert drew nearly every neighbor from the street. I remember sitting in the front row with Evelyn, holding my breath as Lila walked on stage in her pale blue dress, her fingers barely trembling. She played with the kind of focus and heart that made the room forget to move for a while. When she finished, the applause was like a wave breaking over her. She laughed, actually laughed, and ran straight into our arms afterward, smelling of stage lights and the faint polish of her instrument. We've hosted gatherings here since then, something Evelyn once would have found unthinkable. The house that was once a museum is now a place where coats pile up by the door, where the dining room table is stretched to its limit, where friends bring their children and the garden becomes a stage for games and wild chases under the summer sun. Evelyn sits in her favorite chair, tea in hand, holding court with an ease I didn't think she had in her. And sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, I catch her looking toward the window where Lila sits practicing, and her eyes are soft, almost dreamlike. It's not perfect. Life never is. There are still days when Lila retreats to her room after a hard moment at school, still times when the shadow of her parents' absence falls across her face. There are mornings when Evelyn's hands tremble a little too much to hold her teacup, and I can see the years weighing on her. And there are moments when I catch my own reflection in the hallway mirror and remember the woman I was when I came here. Tired, afraid, sure of nothing except the bills stacked on the table and the people I couldn't seem to save. But the thing about living in a house full of music and voices is that the silence never lasts long. One of us always finds the other. A knock on the door, a voice calling from the kitchen, a hand slipping into yours without asking permission. Tonight is one of those nights when the air smells of rain, even though it hasn't yet fallen. The windows are open to the late summer breeze, and the lights in the house glow against the darkening sky. From the garden path, I can see Evelyn moving in the sitting room, adjusting the flowers on the mantel, while Lila stands at the piano in the music room, arranging her sheet music. She's grown taller. Sometimes I have to remind myself she's still just a child. She begins to play, not the hesitant, broken notes of a year ago, but a piece that flows like water, full of confidence, carrying with it everything we've been through. I stand outside for a moment longer, watching the scene through the glass. Evelyn turning toward the music, her face lit by the lamp. Lila's profile bent over the keys, and the warm gold of the room holding them both. And I think to myself, this is what it means to keep a light in the window. Not just for someone who's lost, but for yourself, so that no matter how far into the dark you've gone, you can always find the way back. Later, when the last guest leaves and the music has faded into the comfortable hum of the house, I sit with Lila in her room. She's curled up in her chair, sketching absent-mindedly. I tell her she played beautifully tonight. She shrugs, a little shy still, but she's smiling. "Claire," she says suddenly, her voice softer than the pencil in her hand. "Do you think, if things hadn't happened the way they did, we'd still be here, together?" I don't answer right away. I look at her, at the way her braid has come loose, at the little crease of thought between her brows, and I think about all the ways life could have bent differently. I think, I say at last, that some things, even the hard things, they happen so that we can find each other. And some secrets aren't meant to be kept. They're meant to heal. She nods as if she's known that all along. And when she leans over to hug me, I realize that whatever else the future holds, the light in our window will keep burning. And perhaps, just perhaps, it will guide someone else home one day.